الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Let us begin by trying to finish this section off on the mujib al-amr. So what is our evidence for our position, which we've been talking about? So this passage, or these series of passages that we will briefly touch upon, they provide evidence for correctness of our view from the Quran. So they are directly from the primary sources itself. So he gives the example of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in verse 36, chapter 33 says, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِلَى آخِرِ الْآيَةِ. It's not for a believing man or woman when Allah and His Messenger have decided a matter to have any choice in the affair. Yeah? And this is a negation of choice, and it's a clear indication that the implication of a command is obligation. Yeah. So you'll see that there, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ. And he says, if you look at it, فَفِي نَفْيِ التَّخْيِيرِ بَيَانُ أَنَّ مُوجِبَ الْأَمْرِ الْإِلْزَامِ. Yeah. Then he brings another verse from the Quran, which is what has prevented you from prostrating when I commanded you? Because of the edition we have, it's quite difficult sometimes to. I know there's a new edition, but I don't have that. Maybe when I go to Turkey, inshallah, in October, I'll try and get a few copies. But in any case, this is obviously a reproach to Iblis, I believe. And so Allah is reproaching him for not complying, and such a reproach is only for abandoning a wajib act. Otherwise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never have reproached him. And then there's another verse in the Quran, let those who oppose His command beware lest a trial afflict them. This is a threat of punishment, and the threat of punishment only comes for abandoning obligation. Yeah, there is no meaning to claim that failing to comply to it is not opposition. For example, in fasting, the commanded act is imsak. There's no doubt that breaking the fast without excuse is opposition to what has been commanded. Yeah. So what you have here is a number of things, 5 things going on. One is, if you want to summarize the passage, one is that you have no choice after divine command. I can send you these notes if you want. And so no choice implies obligation, lazim malzoom. Yeah. Number 2 is disobedience implies obligation. So I'm just giving you the way he's arguing, the summary. Yeah. And this is really useful because it gives you tools to think as an usuli. So the concept of isyan only applies when there is a binding command. So this ties into theology as well, because if there's some punishment tied to it, then it's telling you need to do it. Yeah. And then there's a reproach of Iblis, which is an implicit one, because Allah rebukes Iblis for not prostrating, that Allah told him to do it. It wasn't like he has a choice in it, so he's been rebuked for it. Number 4 is there's a warning of punishment, as the verse Surah An-Nur, which warns a fitna of opposing the Prophet ﷺ's command, again implying that the command is binding. And the 5th example he gives is the fasting one. Fasting, the command in fasting is imsak, and breaking the fast without excuse is clearly in opposition to the command, reinforcing that non-compliance is disobedience. 5 arguments there, and I'll send them to you now before I forget. But those are like the 5 key arguments that you need to be aware of. Okay, so you have that. And then, so these are 5 scriptural arguments reinforcing the legal theoretical position that commands from Allah and His Messenger are an obligation by default. Okay, this is what it says. So that's that paragraph done. Then we move on to the next section. ثم الأمر يطلب المأمور بأكثر وجوه يشهد به الكتاب والإجماع والمعقول. You can see what he's doing now. He's brought Quran and Sunnah. Now he's saying, well, I've got other forms of argument as well. So this is something that you'll see in Imam Sarakhsi, that he brings in scriptural, rational, theological arguments to strengthen and bolster his position, right? So he's training you as a scholar or aspiring scholar or a student of knowledge how to reason, how to do things properly. And so to reinforce that the command, especially divine ones, carry the strongest form of obligation. So what's the scriptural evidence? Number one, the command of Allah is not just a request, it is the cause of existence itself. Yeah, we'll come across that here. So because commands seek the fulfillment of what is commanded in the most emphatic manner as provided by the Quran and Sunnah. That's what he's saying. Yeah. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَن تَقُومَ السَّمَاءُ وَالْأَرْضُ بِأَمْرِهِ. Yeah. The skies and earth obey Allah's command. They exist because He commanded them to exist. Yeah. فإضافة الوجود والقيام إلى الأمر ظاهره يدل على أن الإيجاد يتصل بالأمر. Yeah. So this is an important passage for you. Allah says in the Quran, إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون. When Allah gave a command, this is what we call ontological, like existence, wujudi, right? So epistemology is to do with truth, ontology is to do with the study of being. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to, when Allah says to a thing, X, for example, exists, it comes into existence. Yeah. فَالْمُرَادُ حَقِيقَةُ هَذِهِ الْكَلِمَةِ عِنْدَنَا. So we say, this is the haqiqat al-kalam according to us. There's a whole, I'll send it to you later, I've got some footnotes, there's a whole debate on all of this, which we're not going to go into. Yeah? But that's important. So when you read that passage, you have to be aware of all of this. Yeah? And then he talks about some other things. Let's just quickly go through it. Yeah. So فالمراد حقيقة هذه الكلمة عندنا لا أن يكون مجازا عن التكوين. It's تكويني argument كما زعم بعض. This is like a theological debate he's pointing towards. فإننا نستدل به على أن الكلام الله سبحانه وتعالى غير محدث ولا مخلوق لأنه سابق على محدثات أجمع وحرف الفاء للتعقيب. So the حرف الفاء is for immediately, like it's like it comes into existence. Yeah? تعقيب, immediacy, if you like. So what are the key points here? If you like, the command of Allah gave a command, wujudi, takwini, and it came to existence. So this is him. He's arguing for the Quran. Like he's using nusus, but look how beautiful it is. He's using like it's almost like nusus, but it's also thinking about nusus. Yeah, because when Allah says kun fayakun, we take it literally, not metaphorically, to affirm the real power and immediacy of the divine command. It wasn't like it happened later on, right? The fa fayakun is here understood as immediate. Yeah. So what's the theological implications? This supports the doctrine that Allah's speech is eternal and uncreated, since it precedes all created things. The use of the fa in fayakun is instantaneous in effect, reinforcing the decisiveness of the divine command. So he's using theological arguments. So what does all of this mean? What does this theological point mean for fiqh, right? So we think about it. If Allah's command brings the universe into wujud, into existence, then surely His legal commands, pray, fast, believe, must be also understood as binding and obligatory, not optional or merely recommended. I think what he's saying, Allah knows best, that a priori, if Allah's saying this, بطريق أولى, right? That's what we say, بطريق أولى. If this is a theological argument, then it has to work, because that's a stronger form, right? We're talking about God Himself. And so if Allah Himself is like commanding and it happens, then who are we to, like, in our everyday life, think of it otherwise? Yeah. Very powerful synthesis. I mean, this is beautiful. This passage here is beautiful. I mean, you should just, if you just do a bayan on this in a masjid somewhere, or to some ulama, mashallah, they were like, wow, this is like the genius of our ulama. It's a powerful synthesis of Usul al-Fiqh, Kalam, tafsir, linguistics, right? And it's doing epistemology and ontology. These sound like really big words, but you know, like these, when you learn the science like this, it becomes really live, like it becomes a real thing. Yeah, is that okay? So what then he says, فَبِهَذَا, I've highlighted this part. It's the next paragraph. فَبِهَذَا يَتَبَيَّنُ أَنَّ هَذِهِ الصِّيغَةَ لِطَلَبِ الْمَأْمُورِ بِأَكْدِ الْوُجُوبِ. This conveys to us that the form of a command conveys the most emphatic form of request. So what he's done is he's taken you on a journey. Is it ibaha? Is it permissibility? And then he said, no. It's not only is it it's something that's imperative, but it's the most powerful form of imperative. So he's doubled down it almost on the argument. He's showing you how to reason. Yeah. So this passage really concludes the argument that the imperative form, the amr, um, and in legal usage, is inherently and linguistically tied to obligation. He's done two things. He showed how linguistically it's an obligation, but inherently in of itself, لذاته, it's an obligation. Yeah, he's done this because forms. So there's a few arguments here that he will show. Linguistic precision. There has to be linguistic precision. This is the Kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Divine revelation, it's an obligation. There's moral taklif, moral obligation here, and so forth. So linguistic precision, just as verbs and their forms are tied to specific tenses, past, present, future, the imperative form is tied to command and obligation. Words have meaning, they have a purpose. And so just like fi'l madi, mudari, you have the same for amr. It has to be linguistically precise. The second one is this consensus, the ijma and its uses, that when you think about legal theory and everyday common language, when someone demands an action, they use the imperative form. And there has to be something that distinguishes it from other forms. Yeah. And so this universal usage in any language tells you it's an obligation. There's also a default assumption in the background, which is that unless there's clear evidence to interpret something otherwise, the imperative form should be understood as binding. And then obviously he's using a form of linguistic logic, grammatical logic, because amara, to command, is imperative, is transitive, sorry, it's transitive. And we did, what did you say, ta'addi? Muta'addi, sorry, muta'addi basically means that it has to have an object to which you're giving a command to, and or an object of the commanded act, and the natural consequence of this is tamara, to obey. Yeah, does that make sense? So he's kind of really drilled it home. فبهذا يتبين أن هذه الصيغة لطلب المعروف بأكد وجوه. And he's given different arguments for this. Okay. Because there's no command without someone obeying the command. Like, what's the point? Think about it. What's the point of giving a command if no one's going to obey the command? If there's no one to command, to give the command to. Yeah, it's just speech, right? It's just words. Does that make it clear for you? Okay. والمتعدي. So I think that I've separated from here. والمتعدي you should have. Let me just see if I've got mine. لازم والمتعدي فبهذا يتبين لازمه الائتمان. لازمه الائتمان. Have you got it? Yeah. Page 19, second line. Yes. So والمتعدي is like what I've done is والمتعدي. I started a new sentence there, or new paragraph there, if you like. Yeah. It's the way this one's printed. It's difficult to tell when it's paragraph sentences. But the way I've structured it is, it made sense to me that والمتعدي starts from, and there's another, that's like another passage. Yeah. And that's a very short one. It's only a few lines. So والمتعدي, and then if you go down, ائتمار. Yeah, just like فبهذا فبهذا no. وحقيقة الإمام بموجب وذلك وذلك. That's the next passage. وذلك لا يتحقق. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 lines down on the left hand side. That's when it stops. Yeah. It's kind of like confusing the way it's done. So you kind of, it doesn't help because you're already doing something quite complicated, and then the way it's structured. I mean, I know there's a PDF version of the new edition. I'm sure it's looked in there. I haven't looked at it, but this is like extra puzzle for you because you have to work out where the passage is and start. Anyway, so wal mutaaddi, yeah, that's where we're from now. Okay, so um, again, is this, he's basically saying four things here. Commands imply obligation because the verb amara is transitive. It requires an object. We've done that. Just as breaking implies something being broken, commanding implies something done. Yeah. So there's this idea of it has to be for transitive. The second thing is when you have compliance or what's called imar, it's not just occurrence of the act, but intentional volitional performance of it by the one addressed. So there's like this, there has to be like there's an intention for you to do it. And if something happens without your involvement, there'll be no moral responsibility. So he's tying it to moral responsibility. You have to be, you can only be held morally responsible with God if you knew what you were doing. Does that make sense? Yeah. And because reward and punishment are tied to voluntary action, the act must involve choice. Yeah. So this again supports the view that commands are binding and that human agency is essential for moral accountability. This is really, really important here. Yeah. والمتعدي لا يتحقق بدون اللازم. So something has to be. He's making a theological argument here. There has to be something that has to that you have to give the person an order, and there have to be some sort of choice, and there has to be theological consequences of that. Would like to come. Does that make sense? وذلك, that's the next part. Have I skipped something? Okay. Then he says وذلك لا يتحقق إذا اتصل وجود. Have you got that? Yeah. So وذلك لا يتحقق إذا اتصل وجود بصيغة الأمر. That continues. وهو الإلزام. Can you see on next page? Next line, sorry. وهو الإلزام ألا ترى. So that, it stops there. And then he says ألا ترى. That's another passage. You can like think of it as another paragraph. Just 2 lines. ألا ترى أن بمطلق النهي. And that stops at the end of the paragraph, which you can see there. So let's explain that. So this again, he's avoiding my reading of it. He's avoiding Jabriya, determinism. Yeah. If the existence of an act were automatically entailed by the command, it would imply that the addressee has no choice, which would support a deterministic worldview, Jabariya. Yeah. So what he's saying is, the command, it doesn't cause the act, but rather obligates it. He's making a distinction. When Allah gives you a command to do something, it doesn't bring the act into existence, ontologically speaking. All it does is that Allah's morally obliged you now, but you still have a choice to do it or not to do it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Otherwise, if you don't make that distinction, what you're basically saying is when a command comes, you're forced to do it or not to do it, and it's like you're almost falling into Jabariya. You know Jabariya, right? It's deterministic worldview. Yeah. What does this do? Of course, it does two important things for us. As you can see how Usul is tied to Kalam. You have to always think about Kalam consequences. So you can see how this is tied to two things: free will and human agency, and taklif. Because if you don't have a choice in something, how is there moral accountability for it? You're always looking to the day of judgment as well. You have an eye on the day of judgment. Yeah. The second thing he does in this passage is that there's an imperative versus prohibition. Just as a prohibition implies the strongest form of abstention, that you have to stay away from it, but does not cause a non-existence, right? He's building on an analogy before. Remember we said before that just like a nahi is stay away from it, and it doesn't cause non-existence, right? Like he's basically arguing that way. You can extend that analogy. So too, a command implies the strongest form of action, but does not cause the act to exist. Yeah. I call this a linguistic symmetry. Like both sides, you're mirroring it. Yeah. So the imperative and the prohibitive forms are mirror images. They work exactly the same way. Obviously, one seeks a positive action, one seeks an abstention. But this is the critical thing. They are requests, not causes. Yeah, and both imply obligation unless otherwise specified. So he's just responding to someone might say, well, doesn't this just lead to um, if an amr comes, something comes into existence? He says no. That's when you're talking about causal factors. This is a request, maybe consequences, because you need to maintain the delicate balance with free will. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah. And then ومن فروع هذا الفصل الأمر بعد الحظر. Okay, now so he just goes off on a small um, discussion here. There's two lines. It stops at دليل مانع. Yeah, أن يقوم دليل مانع. Just two lines there. So the correct opinion, he says, is that an unrestricted command after prohibition also entails obligation. Yeah, because obligation is the natural entailment of the form of a command unless there is evidence to say otherwise. So, no, I think I've gone ahead. Sorry, I've moved ahead. Sorry, I think I moved ahead. Give me a second. Okay, this is basically a furu. He's addressing a particular scenario. The question is, what is the legal status of a command that comes after a prohibition? So there's a prohibition, there's a command that comes. Yeah. So there's a nahi that comes after an amr. What do we do with that? So this is a furu, and he says some scholars argue that a command like that only lifts the prohibition, i.e., it makes the act permissible, not necessarily obligation. Yeah? Some scholars, but Imam Sarakhsi seems to be saying that even though this has come after a prohibition, because of the form and the way he's been arguing the imperative form, it's the default implies obligation. And since there's no inherent reason why a command after a prohibition should be treated differently, there's no reason for it. There's no reason for it to be treated differently. So he's sticking to his original position, even when it comes after a prohibition. Yeah. So the default ruling is that it remains an obligation unless that it goes back to default position that even if it comes after a nahi, um, the amr will remain an amr unless you have clear evidence that says it's mere permissibility or recommendation. So you might find examples where Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam or in the Quran, I can't think of one right now, where there was a nahi and there was an amr afterwards. The same ayat, you got one ayat or in same or somewhere else, like um, um, because obviously you'd have to. I mean, I can't think of an example right now, but you have to think of an example and then see if it works. So maybe think of an example, or maybe in other books we might have one. But this is consistent with a broader argument, yeah, that the Sayghatul Amr implies ilzam unless there's dalala, evidence to say otherwise. So I think what he's trying to do basically is he's just stressing his principle, right? That's all he's doing. So maybe there isn't a verse, like maybe there is, I can't remember the top of my head right now, but he's stress testing the principle. So this is like the genius of the Hanafis, right? They keep thinking, okay, let's think about different scenarios. Okay. And then he says, وَبَعْدُ أَصْحَابِ الشَّافِعِي. So you can tell what he's going to do now. He's going to bring in an alternative position, which is an alternative view held by some Shafi'is that a command after a prohibition does not imply obligation but rather permission. So he's testing his theory. The reason he gives for them is that the command is seen as a way to lift the previous restriction, not to impose new duties. It's kind of like it's lifting, it's not imposing. Okay? It's like saying, you were previously not allowed to do this, now you're allowed. So when it's allowed, it's lifting, um, it's lifting the restriction. Yeah. So he gives an example, I think here. Um, فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض وابتغوا من فضل الله. Can you see it? Surah Al-Jum'ah. وإذا حللتم فاصطادوا. Can you see that one? So after Jum'ah prayer, believers are told, because what's the verse? وإذا قضيت فانتشروا. انتشر. Allah says after Jum'ah prayer, so the verse before that, you're supposed to go to the prayers, right? After Jummah prayer, believers are told that they may disperse and seek provision. That's not an obligation, it's giving you permission. Like, you don't have to go and fantashiru fil ard. If you want to stay in the masjid and chat to your friends, you can do all of that. You see, so he's saying clearly that's a permission. And it makes sense when the Shafi position says. Or after the ihram, what is it? وَإِلَا حَلَلْتُمْ فَاصْطَادُوا. Once you finish, once you've done your ihram, once you finish, you're not in state of ihram, you can hunt again. But it's not telling you to hunt. It's basically saying you got permission to hunt. So what do we do then? Sounds very airtight, right? And this view obviously contrasts with the earlier position that we just talked about, which is that commands always imply obligation unless there's evidence to the contrary. So Imam Sarakhsi is very honest. He's throwing in curveballs to say, okay, well, so how do we respond to that? So we can see he says, and of course, given that we've reached the end of the passage, he says, وَلَكِنَّا نَقُولُ. Yeah, what's our response? So this again, the key idea is interpretation of Quranic language regarding permissibility commands. So Imam Sarakhsi seems to be arguing that certain actions like trading and hunting in these two verses are deemed permissible not because they are commanded, because the Quran states they are lawful. Yeah. So for example, when Allah says, does he give examples here? وَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ. Yeah, Allah Ta'ala has made bay halal for you. La بِصِيغَةِ الْأَمْرِ. It's a declarative sin, not a command. So he's saying that these are just verses. These are different things. These are verses that are giving ibaha. And he says that in grammar and Islamic law, this is the second argument, the Sayyid the imperative form usually indicates a command. This is true. But then he clarifies that the imperative is not used to lift a prohibition or restriction, but to request an action. Yeah. Remember, for us, it's not for lifting, but this is the usuli farq between us and some of the Shafi'is. That summa sayqatul amr. Can you see the second to last line? Summa sayqatul amr ليست لإزالة الحظر ولا لرفع المنع بل لطلب المأمور به. So based on this understanding, we have differences with the Shafi'is, right? We say that it's not, our asal is to do the لطلب المأمور به, not to lift the prohibition. Yeah, that's what he's saying. Does that make sense? And so he's saying as well at the end that the application of language, mutlaqatul lafz, the general wording of a text should be applied only to what it is truly intended for. So don't overextend the meaning of a word or phrase beyond its intended legal and linguistic scope. Basically, that's what he's saying. And we will, inshallah, stop there. That's quite a interesting conversation there.